Great. Well, we'll get started then. My name's Tammany Baumgarten. I'm a landscaper and a horticulturist in New Orleans, big native plant enthusiast, and the current president of the Native Plant Initiative in Greater New Orleans. And I was asked to come and MC this great event that happens at Hilltop every year, the PlantFest. And so this is the PlantFest teaser, where some of you will have the opportunity to purchase plants in advance. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what's available to you today. So I'm probably preaching to the choir to many of you, but have to explain real quickly why it's so important that we use native plants. And of course, the number one reason is for wildlife value. The natural food web is built on the presence of native plants, period. That should be all I have to say, because it's true. Everything out there starts with something that eats plants, and everything else eats those things. And they're usually insects. And it turns out that many insects are specialists. And what kind of plants are they specialists on? They're specialists on native plants. So when 80 to 90% of our landscapes are non-native, the food web in our areas just break down. And there's signs of that all around us, with bird populations plummeting and insect populations plummeting, and things just not working the way that they're supposed to. And it's only going downhill unless we really work on it. We talk about diversity a lot with native plants, and then of course the maintenance of native plants. I'm real involved with the Louisiana Certified Habitat Program, and it's based on the percentage or the number of different species of native plants that you have on your property and in your garden. And it recognizes that a large percentage and a large diversity of native species is needed to create good habitat and to be good habitat. The fact is that most residential gardens around us have a very high percentage of turf grass. What's not turf grass tends to be a few evergreen meatballs of Asian descent that aren't contributing to the ecology. So there's not a whole lot of diversity unless you make an effort at it. And the traditional landscape does not contain a very vast diversity of plants. And when they do, they tend to all be non-native. Maintenance of native landscapes, of course, is much easier. You're dealing with plants that are used to our soils and our growing conditions and our weather. And therefore they do much better, and they don't need as many inputs. You know, we don't have to fertilize native plants in general. We don't have to shear them and prune them and treat them for diseases as a general rule. So it's a lot easier on you to have a native plant garden. And a lot of the plants we're going to talk about today are specifically adapted to wet areas, to the 60 inches of rainfall that Louisiana gets every year, which makes for, you know, kind of a landscaping dilemma for all those other people that don't know about our great native plants. So back to the primary reason, it's to create habitat and to cater to nature. Nature is very complicated. It's complex. We're learning every day about new interrelationships that exist out in nature. There's lots of moving parts. And it's not just more complicated than we think. It's more complicated than we can think. We just don't grasp it all. And you know what? We don't have to. Nature kind of knows what it's doing. It just needs the components to do it. And those components, we do know, are native plants. That's the cornerstone. It all hinges on that. And that's something that we can control in our environment and in our landscapes. And this is another reason why, you know, the federal and state park system just does not create enough habitat. Even if there was a will, even if there was a way, even if there was money, these lands are very fragmented. There's no substantive mass or corridor that joins them together, and it's just not enough. It's not enough to save biodiversity. And so that's why these efforts need to be taking place in our own yards, and converting our own yards into better habitats so that we can help make up some of this difference. And that entails packing diversity into our yards as much and as best as we can, especially, you know, I garden in New Orleans. I garden in a very urban area. Our properties are small, but let me tell you, in NOLA, they pack it into these landscapes. We use a lot of diversity. We build in layers. We have vines, we have ground covers, we have shrubs, we have grasses, we have trees, and we work it all in. We smash it all in there and really just try to make the most of it. Where you have more rural land, you can work in more of a woodland ecology that's a little more spread out and concentrate more on trees and woodland shrubs and pine ecosystems and things like that. We should be gardening to develop habitats. This looser, natural aesthetic needs to be embraced by homeowners and municipalities, and that's hard to do if you don't see it a lot around you. The more examples that we can show of functioning, beautiful landscapes, I think the more hopefully will be understood how important this is. And, you know, we just need to share our spaces and allow nature in. Our gardens are so much more than ornamentation. They need to function. And again, I know I'm preaching to the choir here. Members of Hilltop are well aware from the beautiful plantings and mature stands of natives at Hilltop, the new prairie, and all the areas there of how beautiful and diverse native plantings can be. All of the plants I'm going to talk about today in this session were sourced from Louisiana growers. Our beloved Rick Webb, who's so good at what he does. And he's really happy to once again participate in this event. And as Rick would say, diversity rules. And so we're going to get on and show you some plants that can add to the diversity in your landscapes. So first we have some trees. American beech is a beautiful native tree. It's sturdy and large. It's deciduous, and it can be 60 to 80 feet tall. It has an upright oval canopy, not recommended for smaller landscapes. This is a big tree. You recognize it in the woods in a couple ways. One, the bark is very, very smooth, which unfortunately tempts graffiti artists to sometimes leave their initials on them in public places. But also the foliage, which we'll talk about in a second. But a little fun fact is that American beech trees can be affected by beech blight aphids. And you might think that's a bad thing, but remember, I told you nature has this all figured out. And beech blight aphids are food for our only carnivorous butterfly. And that's the harvester butterfly that you see in this picture. And harvester butterflies will come and feed on these aphids in your American beech tree, if you're lucky. Beech trees don't normally occur south of the lake for any NOLA people that might be listening. So I don't know if that's probably because they really like good drainage. You see them in association with sweet gum and some oaks and magnolias in particular, which we know need good drainage. One of the things that makes beech trees just so notable in the forest is this tawny fall color, this brown. You know, all the other trees have lost their leaves, but beech trees hold on to their leaves. It's a property called marcescence. And there's a few trees that do that. There's a few other oaks that do that, but none of them do that so impressively as beech trees. And so this is the one reason I like to have beech trees around me. Black cherry is a wild cherry. It's a deciduous. It's a very fast growing tree to about 35 feet. But it's widely adaptable. It'll grow almost anywhere except extreme wet and extreme dry. You'll see this plant often volunteer itself in fence rows or in an understory. It's got, to me, a narrow upright form that you can fit in almost anywhere, even a small garden. I've got one in my back garden. Fits in naturalistic settings, can weave into other trees, and It's an exceptional bird and wildlife tree. In Tallamy's research, they identified over 450 Lepidoptera species that use prunus species. And did somebody have a question? Did I see? No, you weren't raising your hand. I'm sorry, Peggy. Anyway, so this tree grows lots of caterpillars, and we know what great bird food caterpillars are. But in addition to kind of all those little moth caterpillars that make such great bird food, it's also host plant for eastern tiger swallowtails, red spotted purples, white admirals, and some hair streaks. So this is a real good one for wildlife. You will recognize a prunus species by this horizontal striation on the bark. It's very distinctive. And you know you're looking at a prunus. It might not be a wild cherry. It could be a Mexican plum or something else in the family, but that's very distinctive of this species. Who doesn't love a fringe tree? Fringe trees are just beautiful, wonderful understory trees. They can also be a really great standalone specimen. The spring blooms are frilly in April, and late season fruit on the females tell you that this tree is related to olive trees. They produce a drupe that looks very much like an olive and that birds really appreciate. Another difference between the female and the male trees is that female trees will have kind of a greenish white flower, where the male trees are kind of a bright white flower. And here's just a picture of a fringe tree being an understory naturalistic planting, just kind of weaving in amongst other trees. You probably wouldn't even notice this plant if it wasn't blooming. And that's, you know, when we talk about naturalistic settings, that's kind of what we mean. Something that's just going to weave in, do its seasonal thing, and show up when it shows up and go into the background when it's done. Here's kind of a special tree a lot of people aren't familiar with. I've grown it on my property in Mississippi. It's a must-have for butterfly gardeners. This is our only native host plant that I'm aware of for giant swallowtail butterflies. Usually we see giant swallowtail butterflies or caterpillars on our citrus trees. Hop tree, I've been told, is distantly related to citrus, which is why it's allowed to function as a host plant for that caterpillar. But it's easy to grow. It's one of the few trees that will perform well in the shade, but it also takes full sun too. It's highly drought tolerant, which is a useful quality. It'll grow in poor, rocky, or dry locations. It has a number of very descriptive common names. Hop tree is a reference to the prior use of these seeds as a substitute for hops. Wafer ash, because the seed look like wafers when they're done, thin wafers, flat. And stinking ash, because apparently it stinks, although I've never noticed that myself. And you see this little swallowtail caterpillar on him, and there's a big swallowtail caterpillar on that branch. And the seeds are very interesting in themselves once this flower cluster finishes blooming. And wildlife and birds may enjoy those as well. On to some evergreens. Rick Webb has a special knack with Yaupon hollies. And his Yaupons are incredible. I've used them in landscaping, and they always look beautiful. They're always well-grown plants. And he has a real eye for selecting out superior species from the woods. And so when Rick sees something special in the woods, he takes a few cuttings and grows them out. And that's where these two selections came from. El Chico is a male. And in Yaupon hollies, we have males and females. It's the female plant that bears the fruit, but she needs a male around. So, you know, if you're doing a planting and have this space, it's always a good idea to purchase male yaupons to go with your female yaupons. And Rick is one of the only people I know that knows which ones of his are male and which ones are females, and actually grows them specifically for that purpose. Another fun fact, I have heard that yaupon hollies, in fact, Brian Early said this, are universal pollinators for all hollies because evolutionarily they came first. So technically, according to Brian, a yaupon holly can pollinate any of the other hollies and help them to produce berries. So that's another reason why you might want to buy a male yaupon. And from my landscaping experience, you can't get the bees off this plant long enough to put it in the planting hole. They are just all over it, which proves to me that they find it very useful and very irresistible, and that there probably was nothing else around for them to feed on, which made me feel great. Yaupon hollies are great for evergreen screening. They have a medium density, but they'll grow in a super wide range of soils, moist to dry, full sun to part shade. These two selections have particularly tight, smaller foliage, which makes for good shearing in a compact tree form, maybe even topiary. Here's La Chica. And this is the female berrying producing yaupon that Rick is bringing to this event. Again, evergreen shrub to small tree. She's finely textured with a tight, small foliage, little looser and than El Chico, but still an upright habit. Her fruit is very distinctive early. Rick calls it a dull red, but I have purchased this plant from him in fruit, and it's really hard to describe. It's almost like a metallic burgundy. It's really unique. And then the berries, as they ripen, turn a bright red, translucent color. And there's 7 species of birds reported on yaupon, so we know it's useful as a bird plant as well as a pollinator. And it is the only native plant in the US that contains caffeine. So there's a history of it being used to make tea and coffee in the past. A really special pine tree, spruce pine. They're really majestic trees in my experience. They naturally grow in sandy bottomlands and lowlands. So, you know, where I have seen them growing have been kind of in riverine, kind of the edges of streams and rivers where it might flood, but it doesn't have standing water. They can be ID'd by the twisted needles. It's hard to see in this picture, but the needles are very twisted looking. But it also has really distinctive bark that looks more like hardwood bark, looks more like oak trees than it would the shingles that are on most pine trees. And to me, I think it has a very distinctive branching habit. This is kind of typical of the spruce pines on my property. Now, these are older trees, but to me, they branch more like hardwoods do. They're not this light pole of a pine tree like the slash and loblolly pines tend to look. So I just think they're kind of magical. They get up to 75 feet in maturity. And pine trees, they create a very unique habitat and forage. There are lots of mammals and birds that specialize on pine trees and that use the cones or the leaves. There are several species, I think 150 of caterpillars that host on pine trees, and probably not any that you would know off the top of your head, probably mostly moths, but that again just makes for lots of great bird food. And this pine tree is probably a little bit more shade tolerant than the others, so it might be easier to establish in an existing landscape where there's an overstory. Swamp tupelo. This is biflora is my understanding is that it's a cross between Sylvatica and aquatica. So it will grow in wet areas, but it's not the water tupelo that you see with the fluted bases in the swamp. It can get a swollen base if it's in a really wet location. What's great about these to me, of course, there's wildlife food. They create berries or drupes in September. They're great shade trees. But this early fall foliage, and the whole tree doesn't turn this color at once. What you notice is that scattered on the ground are these bright red leaves with splotches on them. And they're all so different that you almost can't walk underneath a tupelo without walking away with a handful of leaves, because you couldn't resist picking them up. They're beautiful. They're bright red, just brilliantly colored. And I'm seeing this now. So that's kind of early for leaf drop. And that kind of makes them special to me. In maturity, they make great den trees because they develop hollows as they age that are real good nesting sites and shelter. And you know, when your goal is to create wildlife habitat and to garden with native plants, I always try to think about plants that I know my neighbors aren't planting, because then I know that there's a niche for this plant. And then I know it's needed. I know that my neighbor is not out buying a swamp tupelo for their backyard. I know they're not buying a spruce pine. I know they're not buying, you know, any of the special stuff that we're going to see here today. So, you know, when you purchase some of these unique native plants, that you are providing something in the landscape that probably doesn't exist around you. And that's some satisfaction comes with that you're putting it there and laying the table for wildlife. Buttonbush is one of the most beloved natives. It grows really well in wet areas. It's adapted to water edges and pond edges, so it's a great rain garden plant. But it also, like many of these wet adapted plants, can be planted in drier sites and do just fine. Buttonbush is really fast growing, as Cynthia knows. She bought one from me a couple months ago, and she said, "My God, Tammany, it's grown 2 feet since I left your place." So it is fast growing, which is great because we usually don't find real big ones in the trade. It does get to 12 to 15 feet tall, and it has kind of a rounded mushroom shape to it. So I think, and I've seen specimens that make me consider this tree a good crepe myrtle substitute, a native crepe myrtle type shaped tree. And I included these slides just to kind of give you an idea of the shape of a mature buttonbush. And then of kind of the winter interest too. These trunks on the left are of a buttonbush, and you can almost see some of the old seed heads still clinging to it, and birds like that for food too. So you've got some winter interest, and this kind of twisted, contorted look is always real attractive to me, especially in a deciduous plant that loses its leaves and shows that off in the winter. One of the hollies, Cassine, this is Dahoon holly. And Dahoon, like a lot of the American hollies, has a dense, upright, kind of pyramidal form. Dahoon's known for kind of a yellow-green foliage. It can get 20 to 30 feet. The female plants, which this Perdido selection, this is a female plant that is going to be at the sale. They can have very heavy fruit set. They're a real dependable holly species. Perdido is a selection from Tommy Dodd, who's a very well-known plantsman in Alabama, and has narrower foliage and abundant but slightly smaller berries than maybe the straight species would. Dahoon hollies can tolerate wetter, shadier sites than a lot of the other hollies, so there's a usefulness in that. And here's a picture of a native landscape with a Dahoon holly, and you can see almost this pendulous quality because there's so many berries weighing down the branches of this young tree. I think probably as trees age, they handle that weight a little bit better, but the young trees are still kind of spindly, but it shows you it's got that potential. Dwarf palmetto. Now, this one is one as a landscaper that I appreciate a lot, mainly because it's evergreen. And, you know, when you get into our native shrubs, we don't have a whole lot of choices of evergreen sort of foundation plantings like we're used to. So this one is very useful in putting some evergreen presence in the landscape, particularly in the winter when everything else has lost its leaves and gone dormant. And then palmettos have this great texture too. You know, in landscape design, you want to be contrasting shrubs, textures, and colors. And so dwarf palmetto is just great and almost gives you a little bit of a tropical vibe because it looks so much like Chinese fan palm. These can get to 8 feet tall. They're a little bit more typically 5 feet. Here's a group of palmettos, fairly mature palmettos at City Park. And this is kind of typical of a mature planting, but it also shows off the winter presence of this plant. You can tell this picture was taken in winter, and this plant works really well as an understory. It'll grow in the shade of other trees, and it'll hold down this presence in the winter when nothing else is going on. Viburnums. We have a number of viburnums that are native to Louisiana. This is possum haw viburnum. It's adapted to low wet woods and bogs. It can reach 12 feet wide and 12 feet tall. So you could treat this plant as almost a small specimen tree in the landscape. The blooms are showy and fragrant. And then the berries start off kind of a white, sometimes pink, and then they mature to a blue-black color, just like our other viburnum. There are 6 moths reported on possum haw viburnum, including this hummingbird clearwing moth that uses it. And Rick says that you have to be from Robert to understand why it's called bombing range. Apparently, there's a place near the Hammond Airport that used to be a target field for pilots to train, and that's where he found this plant that he has been propagating. Rick names a lot of his plants after the places that he sees and locates them, and so therefore some of these colorful names that he attaches to them. One of my favorite all-time shrubs, I love arrowwood viburnum dentatum. Arrowwood's a large deciduous shrub, so it's not small. It wants to be 8 feet by 10 feet. It'll grow full sun to part shade. Viburnums, arrowwoods, they will sucker, they will colonize. So you can very easily end up with kind of a thicket or a hedge screen. I had some plants at my old house in New Orleans that made a beautiful screen. For a deciduous shrub, it's thick enough, even once it's lost its leaves, to give you some privacy and screening without being an evergreen wall. It's the epitome of seasonal interest. It has these spring flowers followed by these blue-black fruits that birds like, and then just stunning fall color, even in woodland shade, which is what's so impressive, especially to NOLA folks. We have such few plants that produce really outstanding fall color, and I consider arrowwood to be one of them. The colder the winter snaps are, the more brilliant the foliage will be. But even in more southern areas of the state, you'll get something that makes this shrub stand apart. Rick says that Ben's Creek, which is this selection, is a little sturdier, maybe a little more tree-like than some of the shrubbier ones that he sells. and maybe more tree-like than the species, with larger foliage. So it's just a bolder, coarser plant in the landscape. Swamp tie-tie, Sorilla. This is an interesting plant. It's sometimes semi-evergreen, but really deciduous. It develops, I was talking about this kind of twisted form. Rick talks about this plant being a good thicket plant, and indeed it is. And you usually see it in nature growing with a bunch of other plants, and you almost can't distinguish it from the other ones unless it's blooming. But I think that planted alone, that this plant has an attractive enough habit where you could use it as a specimen. So there you go. There's two different kind of angles to come at this plant with. Either way, the flowers bees think the flowers are fantastic. It can get to 15 feet or more. When it blooms, these racemes of flowers kind of point downward, which give it a little bit of a weeping habit that's real distinctive. Full sun to part shade, a really great plant. Here's just a little bit better picture of the foliage in the early bloom set. And here's one. This is kind of a racy one that Rick was introduced to. And Johnny Marone, who's another really great plantsman in Louisiana, told Rick where he could go look at this plant. And indeed, Rick found it, took some cuttings, and is growing it. These chartreuse plants are all the rage these days. Everybody likes that kind of pop of color and that contrast. So that's just another kind of interesting aspect behind this plant that seems in all other ways like the species. Sometimes when you get these yellow foliage plants, if they don't have a little bit of afternoon shade, they can look a little bit crispy. So this one in particular probably wants a little bit of shelter, a little bit of afternoon relief. Verticillata, Ilex verticillata. The winterberry hollies are just special plants. We don't always appreciate deciduous plants the way we should. This one is appreciated most once it has lost its leaves, and therefore the name winterberry holly. It's a deciduous holly. Once it loses its leaves, it has retained all these red berries. So it's extremely ornamental in the landscape, and of course, really good wildlife food. The leaves do turn a yellow color before they drop. And it's just really good for naturalistic settings and that winter interest. I have seen these planted as specimens, and I've seen them planted as specimens as street trees, and they were show-stopping. I mean, they were more ornamental than a crepe myrtle can be in the summertime, or just as. I mean, they just were on fire in the winter. And you see these growing along fence lines and drainage areas in the winter because they're very noticeable. It's a plant that is very well adapted to wet conditions, but again, it's adaptable. I would love to see this in more landscapes. I just think it adds so much interest. This one is sourced regionally, which is always better than buying a plant from another state. It'll be adapted to kind of our weather patterns and all that. And at least 20 species of birds have been observed on it, and 6 moths are reported to use it. So we know it's valuable. Some herbaceous plants for you out there. The penstemon, Husker's Red. There's been a lot of breeding work done with these kind of dark foliage penstemons. They're all cultivars off of Penstemon digitalis, which is one of our native penstemons. It's a little bit shade tolerant, but the ones I have grow in full sun. These are pictures of my plants that I'm showing. So, it's really notable how well the flowers show up against the foliage, because the foliage is so dark. And then it's notable that the foliage is evergreen. So all winter long, you have an evergreen basil rosette that has a presence in the garden and that's attractive on its own, even when it's not blooming. So when it does bloom, it gets 2 to 3 feet tall. It can be mixed into any herbaceous border or be kind of a spot of color in a shrubby border too. It can be divided. You know, those rosettes get bigger and bigger over time. And mine always self-seed. So they kind of pop up intermittently in various places. And invariably, I just let them go because they have put themselves in the perfect place and they just look great. So that's always an added bonus when a plant wants to propagate itself for you. Louisiana phlox, woodland phlox is a beautiful, beautiful plant. It struggles in heavy soils sometimes. But what's, you know, I watched a webinar the other day and it was about gardening in the shade. And the speaker was talking about deciduous shade. And what happens with a lot of our deciduous trees, there are plants that are adapted to need that early spring full sun before the tree has leafed out, but then they also need the shade of that tree later in the season in the summertime. And this is one of the ones he mentioned. And so this Louisiana blue phlox wants to get started in quite a bit of sun in the spring, but it does not want full blasting summer sun in late summer. And I hope that makes sense. It made sense to me when I heard it, that plants native to deciduous forest need that highlight early and need the shade later. So this one likes medium moisture, reasonably well-drained soil, part shade to full sun. It's attractive to butterflies. It forms creeping mats over time, so it has potential as a ground cover. Oh, I just love liatris. Just even looking at the slide, it just drives me crazy. It's just got drama. And it comes at the end of the season, you know, when all the butterflies are out, and it just creates so much activity around it. It's so popular with pollinators. It's a native perennial. It creates a bulb. This species, Pycnostachys, is one of the few that will grow in wetter conditions. Rick says it makes an excellent cut flower, but I can't bring myself to do it because there's always butterflies all over it. I just can't bring it inside. They bloom in top-down order. So they have a long bloom period as these blooms progress down this 3 to 5 foot spike that they make. They start in August. They can bloom as late as December. And these came from Rick's own prairie property, so we know they're regionally produced. And I will say that one management technique I've used with this plant, which was, you know, very scary to do at first. In fact, I did it by accident. But if you cut them back before they start bolting, before they start making this flower spike, if you cut them back when they're younger, they branch more. And they become a slightly sturdier plant and don't get quite so tall. So that's something you might try to, you know, control the flop. You know, invariably these are blooming when we get our summer storms. And so there's a certain degree of flop, but the insects don't really care whether they're diagonal, horizontal, or straight up. This is a super valuable plant and just dramatic plant to have in the landscape. This one's real tried and true. This is Stokes Aster. It's easy to grow. As a landscaper, it's a standby for me, mainly, well, for lots of reasons, but it has an evergreen rosette. So it has a constant presence in the garden the same way that penstemon does, even when it's not blooming. And evergreen is essential to having your garden look like something over the winter months. So that's a real attractive feature of this plant. And then you get these really showy blooms and an extended bloom period that goes on for quite a while. I've got some even now that are shooting out a few flowers late in the season. It's drought tolerant. It will grow in part shade. You see it growing here with impatiens. So that kind of gives you some idea. And again, it's just one of those native plants that can look real mannerly and make your garden just a little less, I don't know. I don't know the word. I'll come up with it. You know how people just don't understand us native gardeners sometimes. Well, this plant might help them understand you a little bit better. And there's what I'm talking about, just that evergreen, almost ground cover-ish. And it does, it spreads over time. It can reseed itself. The clumps get bigger and kind of join together. You just have to remember, a lot of people don't think about ground covers as something that's going to be 12 to 18 inches tall when it blooms. So it's really not something you're going to walk through. Solidagos, all of the goldenrods are highly, highly valuable wildlife plants. We're learning now that a lot of bees are specialists and require pollen from certain plants to pack their nest with. And goldenrod is certainly one that is full of pollen late in the season for all of the pollinators. Problem with goldenrod is that not all of our goldenrods are garden worthy or very mannerly in the garden. We have a lot of really tall goldenrods that fall over because they get real heavy. Common goldenrod that you see all over the roadsides right now, that is really not an acceptable garden plant. And coming from me, that means something because almost everything's acceptable. Common goldenrod is not. It suckers, it reseeds, it's just not very well behaved at all. And it's a thug, it outgrows other plants. However, rugosa, rough-leaf goldenrod, this is a cultivar off rugosa that stays 3 to 4 feet. It's got this nice garden habit, kind of this cascading look to it when it blooms, which I'm sure is why they called it fireworks, kind of like falling fireworks. And it's just a really nice, it's been in the industry for a while, so it's been tried and true. It will colonize over time. You know, the clumps will get larger, but it won't run like some of the other goldenrods do. Blue-eyed grass, such a sweet plant. Blue-eyed grass is, I don't know, what, 10 inches tall. They call it a grass, but it's in the iris family. And when you look at the leaves of the plant, you can almost tell that it's an iris family plant. And it's another one that's real useful in creating a more conventional landscape. It can be used as a border, just like monkey grass or liriope. But then it's got just this beautiful, sweet blue bloom. And it blooms early. You know, it starts blooming sometimes as early as February when we're really dying for some color and some pizzazz in the garden. Here's another picture of it not blooming, but it shows that character where the clumps keep getting bigger over time and it can form a ground cover. And, you know, when we talk about green mulches and plants that will cover the soil, this is one of them. And you see it here growing under a button bush, and it's going to bloom and do its thing just fine in that part shade under that deciduous plant. And then just another plant that, I don't know why, this just kind of makes me sigh when I look at it. It's very relaxing. It's kind of soothing. Cherokee sedge is highly touted as a really good landscaping sedge. You can use it as an individual clump, or you can kind of let them bleed together as a ground cover. It's got this cool blue color. It's a tough plant. It loves moisture, but it'll tolerate dry. It's drought tolerant and just a real fine textured plant, again, that contrasts well with our shrubbier shrubs. So yeah, I've planted sedges out in my garden in distinctive clumps where I can appreciate them kind of as ornamental grasses. And speaking of grasses, this is one of our native grasses. It's distinctive because it'll grow in the shade. And this is where you find it in nature, usually growing along stream banks and places like that. But it's not particular. So it grows in our heavy soils in New Orleans just as well as it grows on a stream bank in Abita. Casmanthium can grow 2 to 4 feet. It's most notable for these ornamental seed heads that form in the summer and then turn kind of a tawny paper brown, really beautiful, reminiscent of oaks. And again, you know, it grows in the shade. It does reseed quite readily. So, you know, I'm always looking at for those volunteers that have moved themselves around, and it's got just all this seasonal interest. I was recently looking up skippers because their skipper butterflies are real common in gardens right now. And I kind of had to reteach myself that a lot of the skippers use grasses as host plants. And so it made me have an appreciation of having grasses in the landscape, of mowing high, because they'll even use some of our turf grasses. But we do know that some Lepidoptera species use this grass. And for that reason, we just appreciate it a little bit more. And, you know, we don't have to understand what each plant in our landscape is for. We don't need to know what each one is a host plant for, but know this, that if it's a native plant, there's something out there that needs it, and there's something out there that uses it. Nature is not frivolous. It doesn't put energy into these plants for no reason. If it's there, it has a role to play. So that's why we push diversity so highly. We don't have to understand it all. We just need to pack it in, and nature will kind of take it from there. Because, you know, if our cities keep looking like this, and they will, nothing's changing anytime soon, and our countrysides keep looking like this, and they will, and the average landscape keeps looking like this, and our neighborhoods keep looking like this, and our gardens need to be looking more like this, and having some of these great native plants that bring functionality to the landscape. There's scattering of public parks and federal lands. That's just not going to cut it. It's not going to keep ecological diversity alive. It's on us to be part of that tapestry that keeps it all going. And what's more, you know, all that's important, but gardening with natives and gardening for habitat is so rewarding. It's tenfold more rewarding than traditional landscaping. Every day you see things thriving and living. There are new discoveries. It's a dynamic landscape that's always changing, and being a part of that and fostering it in our yards is just, you know, there's nothing like it. Because, you know, we need to keep these vast systems alive. We don't need to understand it all, but we need to do our part, because nature is just complicated, and it's more complicated than we think. It's more complicated than we can think. So I appreciate that Hilltop is doing its job, as it always has, bringing these plants to you. We all know how hard they are to find. We all know how underappreciated they are. And these events at Hilltop are just famous for what they bring to us as gardeners. The plants that we've talked about here today are available during the virtual plant teaser, which is a members only event. And then there is a members only physical plant sale, and then a sale that's open to the public will be later in the month on October 23rd. If you haven't been to Hilltop lately, it is worth the trip just to see beautiful native plants in action. The native prairie is fantastic, and you know, all those prairie plants really shine late in the season. This is what we plant them for, is for September, October, November beauty. If you don't know anything about Hilltop, go online, find out about it, become a member, and and visit the site. It's really wonderful. So it's been my pleasure. Peggy, thank you for inviting me to do this for you. I spoke to Rick a couple days ago. He's tickled to always be involved in these events too. And I'm sure we'll all be seeing each other real soon.